everyone, welcome back to another video. Last time we left off with the Great Explorations. I'm going to make a slight change to this series probably. I think I'm going to make it just one of these topics because that last video was a little long and I get maybe too long of videos, sometimes not as fun. But if you guys would prefer longer videos, I can. Yeah, we just showed a lot of the great explorations of the 1600s and kind of getting to how a lot of the Americas were colonized. But now we're on to Virginia and the South. Virginia, in 1607, is the oldest of the 13 colonies. Georgia, 1733, the youngest. All the southern colonies bear in their name the time of their origin. Virginia celebrates the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth I. Maryland, Queen Mary II. The two Carolinas, King Charles II, and Georgia, King George. They had a warm climate suitable for stable plantation crops, which could be worked by slave labor. All the colonies recognized slavery, but in the more northern colonies, a region of cold winters, small farms, and commercial occupations, slavery was less profitable and eventually died out. Some northern colonies, however, shared with England and the South the shipment of black slaves from Africa. No permanent settlement was made in Elizabeth's time, though there was much exploration and some abortive attempts at colonization. The first settlement was made at Jamestown in the reign of James I, under the auspice of the Virginia Company of London. It was kept alive under great difficulties by the vigorous activity of Captain John Smith. He had a romantic disposition and may have been something of a romancer in his narratives. All Americans know the story of his rescue by Pocahontas, an Indian maiden who later married not Smith, but one of his comrades, John Rolfe. In 1619, the year when Virginia was settled, a legislative body was constituted, slavery was introduced, and a group of young men or a group of young women, was brought over to become the wives of the settlers. There was no absolute compulsion to marry, but the women knew what to expect, and the men eagerly awaited their coming. Often, the dowry was paid in tobacco, the staple crop. Eventually, the company charter was revoked and direct royal authority established. A House of Burgesses represented the voters of the colony. The capital was established at Williamsburg, where many of old buildings still stand and some others have been restored. Governor William Berkeley, who boasted that Virginia contained no printing presses or free schools, ruled so harshly that he provoked the rebellion. Look at this, isn't that pretty? The rebellion of Nathaniel Bacon, specifically. Reprisals were taken against the rebels, and so many were hanged that Charles II impatiently said, "That old fool has put more men to death in that naked country than I did in all of England for the murder of my father." Virginia was mainly royalist and Anglican, but Bacon's rebellion showed that there were limits to its tolerance. The colony played a large part in the preliminaries of the American Revolution in Patrick Henry, and it furnished the sword of the Revolution in George Washington and the pen of the Revolution in Thomas Jefferson. Most of the settlers were English, but there were some Germans and Scot-Irish. All in all, Virginia may be said to have been not only the first in origin, but the first in influence during the colonial times and in the earliest years of the Republic. Maryland was the undertaking of Lord Baltimore, whose name is preserved in the name of its chief city. Like Virginia, its staple crop was tobacco. Lord Baltimore desired tolerance for his fellow Roman Catholics, um, but also established tolerance for all Christians. There was difficulty in determining the boundaries of the new colony, but eventually two surveyors, Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon, drew the line between Maryland and Pennsylvania. As Pennsylvania became a free state, this Mason-Dixon, uh, yeah, this Mason-Dixon line became famous as the northern boundary of slavery. North and South Carolina were uh, uh, were curiously different. South Carolina, wealthy and aristocratic, a region of great slave plantations, in some respects resembled the colonies of the West Indies rather than those of the American mainland. North Carolina was more of a region of small farms and relatively poor men, and it had no large cities such as Charleston in South Carolina. Georgia was a philanthropic enterprise of James Oglethorpe, who wanted to find a home for distressed debtors and religious refugees. In his original plans, there was to be no slavery, no intoxicating liquor, and a concentration on growing silk, grapes, medical plants, and other commodities lacking in England. All these restrictions were later abandoned, and Georgia became a typical Southern slave state. Although slavery has long ceased to exist, the South remains in many respects unique as compared with the rest of the nation. It is still mainly agricultural. There has been, as everywhere, some urbanization, but far less than in the North. People still live in an open air life and are accustomed to ride, hunt, and shoot. In the early republic, the South, although scarcely having one-third of the population, took a great part in the nation's leadership, both in peace and war. Of the first 12 presidents, 9 were from the South, and uh, of the first 5, Virginia supplied 4. Though the Civil War reduced Southern political leadership, it may be ventured that a fair half of the most distinguished Army officers in all of the American wars had a Southern background. The colonial South was aristocratic in attitude, although most of its first families were of recent origin. Few were of the English gentry, and almost none of the nobility uh, almost none of the nobility cared to emigrate to the colonies. They lived a more leisurely life and had a wider range of amusements than most settlers farther north. Some were religious deists, accepting the creation but denying the authority of the Bible. It was a latter development that caused H. L. Menkex to label the South as the Bible Belt. The white population of the South, although it contained some German, French Huguenots, and Scots-Irish pioneers, was more purely English than anywhere else. Most European immigrants had gone to the cities of the North. Yeah, this is actually, I mean, it's talking about quite a fair few things. Obviously, Virginia is by far one of the most influential early states. It's one of the most influential colonies, and it will be influential for a long time. Now, its influence has greatly diminished, and compared to what it once was, it doesn't really have much influence at all. But it is still influential throughout the history of the states. and you really can't deny the history of it. Uh, and the more English ancestry in the South will play a big part in the revolution because there will be a lot more loyalists in the South, and there will be fights between the loyalists and the rebellionists. I can't, that's not the word, but you know what I mean. Um, and it will really show how divided sometimes it could be. A lot of the loyalists will leave after the war, and things will be a little tenuous in the South. But yeah, the South has had lesser population, but it has more of the crops. North has always had more population, but more of the industry. Um, Even today, you can, like they said, still see that. Obviously, this book was made even quite a few years now, about 50 years ago, um, almost. Not quite. It's more like 40 some, but still. But it does show quite a bit of the differences still there, and they still very much exist today. You can even look at that. And the Bible Belt is still a term used today. It's still very common. But now we can get into what all these pictures are. You know, I like showing them, but it's a nice explanation of them. So this photo, this picture here, is John White, the cartographer of Sir Walter Raleigh's expedition to the New World, created a map of the area around the settlement of Roanoke, in what is now the state of Virginia. So this is the colony of Roanoke. Now Roanoke disappeared, disappeared, and it was a big mystery. We still don't really even know what happened to the people of Roanoke. Um, they were there when he left. When he came back, they were not, and the signs of what happened, we don't know because he had to leave too early because the ship that brought him back um, was like, "Hey, we're leaving," and he had to go. So he didn't have the time that he needed to investigate what fully happened. But a lot of historians think he probably knew what happened to them, but we just don't, because obviously he never said. There's a lot of theories, but we'll never really know. But obviously Roanoke does not work. It is unsuccessful, and it's a good place for a thing because you have these islands out here, it's the Outer Banks, and you have this inner waterway, and it hides Roanoke Island. So it was a good place for a settlement because the Spanish still kind of claimed a lot of this territory, and so they were patrolling this, and this would be hidden from a Spanish patrol by these islands. So it's a really good place for it. Just sucks it didn't work. Jamestown, though, Jamestown works a lot more efficiently. Still had some struggles, but it manages to succeed. And at the top, can't tell which one. Oh, okay. This is the one I want to look at. This is Pocahontas, the daughter of Chief Powhatan, and was taken to England, where, at the age of 21 in 1616, she was painted while wearing an Elizabethan English costume. So that is a painting of Pocahontas. Quite interesting, if I do say so myself. And then here is an engraving of the legend of the rescue of Captain John Smith by Pocahontas. You can see he's to be put to death, and Pocahontas saves him. Obviously, there's a Disney movie based on it. That whole movie is it's very inaccurate, but Pocahontas did save John Smith. At least that is the legend. How she saved him, we don't know fully. You know, we have some ideas, but once again, it's like you never really know the whole story of everything. People are going to tell different stories based on, so we'll never fully know, but we have some idea. And then this is the old church, the old Brutton Parish Church in Williamsburg, Virginia, and it was completed in 1715. Yep, churches are always an importance back then. You can see a lot of the painting of these individuals. It's very, very interesting. I find a lot of these old paintings so neat. Paintings or old pictures or things like that. I believe this is a painting. I don't think this is a picture, but it's kind of hard to tell. And then at the right, one of the most popular sports of the outdoorsmen of Virginia and Maryland during the colonial period was riding to the hounds on a fox hunt. Yeah, fox hunts, they don't really exist today. They do kind of. I think England, well, the United Kingdom just recently fully banned them, I believe. But they were a very popular thing for nobility to do for a long time. What you would do is you would get a bunch of hounds, they'd hunt down a fox, the fox would try to run, and you on horseback would chase down and try to shoot the fox. And the above left is the port of Baltimore in the colony of Maryland. It was a thriving little community in 1752. Now you can see, nice little painting there. Very nice, I think. It's really cool to see some of these old paintings, you know. That's why I like doing these series, because there's sometimes paintings that most people wouldn't see, they wouldn't learn about in American history, or even people outside of the U.S. that wouldn't learn about this stuff. So it's very interesting. And then above is, oh wait, no, here, this little guy here is a painting of Cecil Calvert with his grandson. He was the second Lord of Baltimore, following George Calvert, the Roman Catholic founder of Maryland. If it'll focus on him there. Definitely important people. The Calverts, very important family in there in Maryland. And then up here is another example of settlers coming to the colonies to escape religious intolerance, were the Tyrolean Lutherans. They had been persecuted in Salzburg, in what is now Austria, a Roman Catholic city, and emigrated to Georgia. There was a lot of instances of this. Obviously, the Puritans, so the Pilgrims, for a lot of Americans, they kind of caused that themselves. I'm just going to be honest here. Okay, we're going to get to the Pilgrims. A lot of them, they kind of caused it themselves, but they did obviously form an important thing. But it does show a lot of religious exiles, you could say, or um, people who were persecuted for their religion. They tried to escape, and they got away pretty successfully a lot of times. And at the right here, the English philanthropist James Oglethorpe founded the colony of Georgia in 1733 as a home for debtors and religious refugees. He is shown introducing a group of Georgia Indians in London in 1734 to the trustees of the colony. You can see a lot of natives, and you can see obviously them. And an interesting little thing here is they have a young Indian boy dressed in English attire, trying to show the merging of the two cultures. Interesting way to paint this. But yeah, this had happened a lot. Obviously a lot of these people don't know the natives, and this is kind of a way for the natives to get a degree of delegation to England itself. So sometimes this was actually a lot of things that they would have liked to do because it might have helped them at some points. But that's going to do it for this video. If you guys liked the video, leave a like. If you have any ways you can improve these videos, leave a comment down below. I always appreciate your feedback. And as always, subscribe. It really does help out the channel. Thank you.